Welcome back to Beyond the Veil Stories. Today's story is brought to you by Wild T9242. I lost my sister to the Fae Part 3. This is the final part of the series. If you want to watch Part 1 and Part 2 first, they are in a playlist on the channel. A big thank you for allowing me to use your story in a video. If you're interested in reading their story yourself, the links to both their story and profile is in the description below. Now, let's take a journey beyond the veil. I told Dustin about the monster that was chasing Zoe and I. He told us that it belonged to a species of Fae called Redcaps, a malevolent type of goblin which he and my grandma's grandmother told them horrific stories about when they were younger. Their grandmother told them their hoods were always blood red because they needed to regularly soak them in the blood of humans to survive. If it were to ever dry out, they themselves would die. However, Dustin figured out a weakness of the Redcaps. The same thing which allegedly kept them alive, human blood, or so the tale goes at least, also could kill them. While he wasn't sure if their hoods were always soaked in blood so they could live, he was sure that their grotesque bodies underneath were deathly allergic to our blood. He told me how he knew this. When he had escaped so long ago, Aurdone had recruited such a vicious creature back then, too, and it looked identical to the one that had chased us, except that one wielded a terrifyingly large hammer, still stained with the gore of its last victim, and ours had a scythe, like the Grim Reaper. He narrowly avoided being slaughtered by the goblin, because when it finally caught up to him and grasped him with its claws, it recoiled as if his pale little leg had burned it. His leg had been hurt by Aurdone during his escape. She had raked long scratch marks over it. He showed us the scars too, and they were deep enough to bleed. The Redcap, in trying to grab him from this very hole we were in now, had gotten a handful of human blood on its bare flesh. Then it died. Dustin recounted, rummaging through a burlap sack full of objects behind him. It let out this scary scream of pain, and it just disappeared. See, look. He proudly produced a crimson cloak with a pointed hood from the sack as proof. Our jaws dropped. We were thoroughly impressed. I think they were these things so they don't get stained with blood. It had rags on its hands, but I pulled them off when it tried to grab me the first time. Wow. I didn't know what else to say. Then, Dustin pulled out a few more things. One, a dagger, which definitely looked like it belonged to this whimsical realm. Not just that, but these little glass vials that reminded me of test tubes, with little woven cords tied to them to turn them into necklaces. It sounded like he had many glass things in there, judging by the clanking noise, but he only pulled out a necklace vial for each of us. I pieced together in my head what he wanted us to do. "She'll cry," I warned as he uncorked one of the vials. "Yeah, but she'll live," he countered with a wisdom that was beyond his visual age. Zoe looked disgusted as he took the blade of the dagger and sliced his own finger. He barely flinched as he did it, and he took the little opening of his vial and held it under the cut so droplets of blood could slide inside. When it was full, he corked the small glass bottle again and put the cord over his neck so it could dangle above his chest. After that, he grabbed a glass jar of what looked like fresh water from a stream. I could see tiny bits of plants in it, and used it to wet a scrap of cloth to clean the blade with. He was smart enough to clean his blood off. I had to remind myself he lived for just as long as Grandma, even if he looked younger than me. "That's gross." Zoe looked at his bleeding finger, which he popped into his mouth. He shrugged at her, then handed the dagger and 2 of those vials to me. I did the same as him, and then put mine over my head. It felt really weird to wear a vial of my own blood, but I guess it couldn't be helped. I cleaned the blade the same way he had, then looked at Zoe apologetically while gesturing for her hand. "Is it going to hurt?" Her bottom lip trembled. I nodded. "Close your eyes." She did as I said, and I quickly sliced her finger. I felt her body jerk, and a few tears squeezed out from her eyes. "It's safer if we all carry our own blood," Dustin said as I collected Zoe's blood in her own vial. and then put it around her neck. In case we get separated, we know the other will be okay, right? I watched as Zoe put her finger in her mouth and sucked the blood off. I know we're in a rush, but we need to think of a plan. How exactly did you escape? Dustin told us how he had escaped Aurdone's residence. He spilled the boiling pot of water sprites she had been cooking, and when she was distracted bending over to collect the creatures, they are very manic about their food, he'd said. He stabbed her from behind and kept sawing at her neck with the dagger until her head was only connected to her shoulders by a few ropes of flesh. Then, he'd taken the key from her neck and freed himself from the collar. It was disturbing to see him regale such a thing so casually, but I had to remind myself that he'd been stuck here for decades in mortal realm time. But then how is she alive? Zoe had asked, looking like she didn't believe him. Her head grew again. Dustin looked like he didn't understand it himself. I don't know how or why, but cutting the head off doesn't work. I heard iron is able to kill them. I showed him the iron things I had brought with me, and his eyes gleamed with sadistic glee. Neato. Dustin smiled, his teeth yellow and crooked. I've been wishing I had iron for so long, and now we do. However, he said that while it was great we had iron just in case, the Fae people were very cautious of touching iron, so we would need to be clever about it. Since we only had one shot, the plan remained the same. We would try to decapitate Aurdone to at least render her unable to chase us until we made our escape. Once she was incapacitated, then we could use the iron if we had the time. Zoe would keep Boza busy, with me being the distraction for Aurdone, and then Dustin would ambush her and hack at her neck with his dagger until her head was severed once more. This would be his revenge for her stealing his life away from him. She won't fall for the same trick again, though. Dustin warned, but my granny always told us that Fae people never turn down food or a chance to dance to a good tune. Zoe made a face, clearly doubting this. Dustin noticed and shot her a glare. I'm the one that's been trapped in Weirdsville. I think I know what I'm talking about. I tried it once on the small one, here, and by small one I assumed he meant Boza. He produced some oddly shaped glass vases and cups and delicate china spoons, clearly not from our world. He tapped the spoons against the glassware he'd lined up in front of him, creating a gentle string of light, tinny musical notes. The glowing bug-like things in the jars stopped flying about wildly and stilled themselves, landing on the side of their glass prisons closest to Dustin. See, the pixies like it, he'd said. Zoe's eyes brightened at that. Pixies! She grabbed a jar and scrutinized the orbs of light resting inside. He snatched it back from her. They're not like how you think. They're just lights with wings. Dustin set the jar back down gingerly. But they're fragile, so be careful with them. We should go now. We stuffed the glassware into my backpack. Then, the three of us left his underground hovel, which I remember at some point he had told me had contained a sort of elf or gnome that had clearly died of old age and remained as a horrifyingly mummy-like, dried-up carcass. We couldn't see or hear the Redcap, but still, we stuck close under the shade of the trees, ducking and jumping at every sound, following Dustin's lead. He seemed very skilled at being stealthy, intensely on his guard in case something would sneak up on us. The forest was teeming with giant beetles and centipedes. Then, Zoe screamed out of nowhere, scaring the crap out of us. She'd been traveling behind us, so we could protect her. Me and Dustin turned to see that she was sitting on the ground as if she'd fallen in shock, staring in wide-eyed horror up at a tree. No, not a tree, a woman. It looked like someone had carved the figure of a woman into a tree, but clearly it was some nature spirit or hybrid of some sort. She was posed as if she were trying to blend in with the surrounding trees, much like a chameleon would, her arms upturned and ending in branches, and her golden yellow eyes with no irises or pupils blinked at us before shutting. She became still again, statue-like. She looked utterly creepy, but she seemed docile. That's just a dryad, blockhead. Dustin snapped. "Are you trying to get us, Dash?" We heard the sound of fabric whooshing above us, and we all three turned our heads upward just as the Redcap descended upon us with its scythe raised. In one swift motion, it swung its blade and decapitated Dustin right in front of us, cutting off his horrified scream and eliciting one from me and Zoe as our great-uncle's head rolled across the ground. His blood stained the blue-colored grass red, and his eyes and mouth remained open in an O shape. Just as swift as the Redcap had appeared, it had also disappeared in a flash of crimson in order to dodge out of the way of the spray of blood. I grabbed Zoe and ran through the forest, sparing only one glance behind me to see the Redcap removing the hood part of his cloak and dragging it along the ground where Dustin's blood was spilled. Its head looked ghastly and made me want to faint from terror. I remember that much, but for the life of me I can't recall the details. Not because of how long it's been, though. Even right then and there after I turned my head back around to keep my gaze focused on where I was going, I immediately had forgotten the sight of his flesh, as if it were some sort of spell. The horrible cry of the Redcap, reminiscent of a saw splintering thick wood, echoed out, causing all the small critters in the area to immediately withdraw out of instinct. Pixie lights faded away, and strange-looking insects scampered out of sight. I didn't know how long we could outrun that monster, and after seeing what it did to that poor boy, I didn't want to take any chances. Nearby, there was a large log lying on its side, and so I guided Zoe to hide inside of it. However, I wouldn't fit, and I could hear the Redcap flying closer, weaving through the trees in search of us from a bird's-eye view. I promised her I would be back soon and rushed to find my own hiding spot, ducking under shadows whenever I heard the rustling of fabric draw too close. I quickly came across a waterhole, something of a small pond, and on one elevated side of it the ground jutted out like a ledge with little roots hanging down. I hid my backpack under a bush, so the monster couldn't spot the bright purple color and find me. I dove into the water as quickly and quietly as I could, slipping to hide under that dirt overhang. When the Redcap stopped circling, then I would go and find my sister and continue the plan. I listened to the Redcap cry out nearby with bated breath, tears running down my face as my mind kept replaying the murder of Dustin. Would we ever make it out of here alive? For a second time that night, a tiny stream of water was squirted against my cheek. I winced and looked to see a cluster of water sprites looking at me. Their eyes were wide-set and looked exactly like a fish's. The humanoid torsos weren't flesh-colored, but rather colored like a minnow, sleek with little scales, and their hair was essentially one long fin, ranging from orange to green to gray. They are kind of ugly, with their little webbed fingers and wide, fish lips, but also kind of cute. One of them puckered their lips and spouted water from their mouth at me again. Then they all splashed around playfully, as if in amusement. A school of them surrounded me curiously. That's when I got an idea. It seemed that these Fae people commonly used these little fish creatures as a source of nutrition, and Dustin had said the Fae were very serious and even downright crazy about their food. They would never pass up a chance to eat or be swayed by beautiful music. I also thought about how I had placed iron in the chocolates, which were still in my backpack, basically poison Fae food. But I didn't want to waste the chocolate on the Redcap. I had only two, one for Aurdone and one for her demonic little offspring. So, what if I offered a poisoned water sprite to the Redcap? Would it stop and eat it first, proving Dustin right? Or would it just kill me like I feared? But how would I poison it? I didn't have any tiny pieces of iron on me that I could make it swallow. Then I remembered what he'd said about our blood being lethal to a Redcap, and my eyes lit up. I snatched up one of the water sprites, and its slimy body squirmed frantically in my grip. I uncorked the vial hanging around my neck and forced its mouth open. It was gross, but I poured every drop down its throat, making it ingest my blood. Then I climbed out of the pond and went out in the open, sparing one glance at the log, where Zoe hid, before summoning up enough nerve to call out for the Redcap. "Mr. Redcap, sir, I have some food, a peace offering." I was terrified. My knees were shaking. I regretted the words as soon as they left my mouth, but it was too late to go back on my plan. I heard another monstrous cry and the flapping of a cloak as the Redcap immediately zeroed in on my position. Did this thing even understand English like the fairies did? I held out the water sprite as it came into view and swooped towards me. I couldn't help it. I cried out in fear at seeing it raise its scythe and fell back on the ground, releasing the water sprite and letting it flip over the grass like a fish out of water. I closed my eyes and waited for my death, but it didn't come. I peeked through one eye and saw the Redcap leaning over, grunting and chasing after the water sprite as it desperately tried to crawl its way back to the pond where I took it from. It stabbed the mini mermaid's abdomen with a single black claw and brought it up inside its long hood. I couldn't see it eating, but I could hear it chewing through scales and meat and crunching tiny bones. I couldn't believe it. My plan was working. It was actually eating it. I stood up and watched as the Redcap suddenly let out a choking sound and seemed to grasp its throat with both hands, dropping the scythe. Its head cracked towards me, and I flinched. It wanted at me, realizing I had deceived it, and reaching for me with claws that could absolutely gore me. But then, it dropped into a heap of red, bloody fabric on the ground, no longer a grotesque body under the cloak. I crept forward and yanked the cloak away to be certain, and sure enough, there was nothing under there but grass. I wanted to cry from relief, but then Dustin's loss hit me again, and I wept a little, then collected myself and found Zoe. Morbidly enough, Zoe took the hood and wore it, although it had Dustin's blood on it. I gave her a look that said I thought she was crazy for doing so. "It's a trophy," Zoe sniffed. "Dustin had one, too. I'll keep it for him." I respected that, so I left the subject alone and gathered the large scythe from the ground. It was a bit heavy, but I was going to use it all the same. I retrieved my backpack, and we set off to Aurdone's cottage. Despite its homely appearance, it loomed quite forebodingly in the distance. When we got to the meadow, Bozo was running and playing outside. I took my backpack off and began preparing things for our plan, setting out the material gifts I wanted to give to the Fae Mother, like the jewelry. Zoe helped me set up the glasses on the ground, and we began playing our music, hitting the cups and vases with the delicate spoons to create a soft, tinkling melody. This got Boza's attention, and she ran inside the house. "Be ready," I whispered to Zoe, nudging her with my arm. "You have to play with Boza and distract her when I give the signal." I glanced at the scythe I had laid behind me. Dustin was going to kill her, now he's dead. Zoe looked scared and lacking in any confidence for our plan now that the boy was gone. Boza came back out of the cottage with Aurdone in tow. They stood still as statues staring at us, before they both walked calmly towards where we sat, not even using their wings to fly. Nervous couldn't begin to describe how I felt. I heard Zoe's breath become labored. "You returned," Aurdone said stoically, looking at the glassware arranged as makeshift instruments in front of us. "Sorry for coming uninvited. I tried to keep up the fake politeness all my sources instructed me to show even the most evil of Fae. We wanted to play some music for you, and I have gems to offer you." I gave her the necklace, which was a chain beaded with little fake crystals that could have very well been plastic for all I knew. I just hoped she wouldn't notice. Aurdone held out her hand, her fingers spindly like spiders' legs, and her nails manicured and sharp. I draped the jewelry over her palm and swallowed the lump in my throat. She looked at it before squeezing it in her grip, then opening her hand to let the dust she'd grounded into fall into the grass. "You give me a gift not worth a grain of sand," Aurdone stated, with an unsettling level of serenity that felt like the calm before the storm. The air suddenly became electrified as I felt an intense aura of wrath emanate off her. "Can Zoe play with Boza?" I quickly asked. Boza's face brightened, and she looked hopefully at her inhuman mother. Aurdone nodded once, and Boza immediately grabbed up the chain linked to my sister's collar and dragged her towards the house. Zoe gave me one last helpless look before following. When they disappeared into the cottage, it took everything in me not to back away as Aurdone knelt across from where I was sitting cross-legged and laid her hands in her lap. Her black, empty stare drilled holes into me, and I couldn't tell what she was thinking since her face was completely void of emotion. "Did you like my music?" I stammered, my musical notes faltering as my hands, which held the spoons, trembled. "It's my gift to you for taking care of my sister while she's been here. I meant none of this, of course. You have slain the Redcap." Aurdone pointed a claw at the scythe behind me. "You intend to slay me next. You feign ignorance and respect." She said this all matter-of-factly, as if she could read my mind or see inside my soul. And no slaying. I rushed these words out in a panic. I want to trade these gifts for my sister's freedom. I put down the spoons and laid out more cheap stuff from the thrift store and the candy which had not been poisoned. "Your sister's freedom has a high price, and by the look of what you've offered me, you cannot afford that price," Aurdone said, and I hated her with all my being in that moment. She sounded prideful, as if she thought herself above me. Her next words shocked me, though. "An equal trade would be another pet, or, in your case, a labor slave. You have physically matured beyond the privilege of being Boza's pet, but you can dedicate your life to the servitude of my bloodline." I assumed she meant I was too old, and thus too strong, as I would overpower the demonic little brat, to be Boza's plaything, so I would instead work for her for the rest of my natural-born life. I thought carefully. My research said you had to be clever when dealing with the Fae, and even Dustin said she couldn't be fooled so easily twice. This was not some mindless monster. This was another intelligent being, and that scares me deeply. Of course she would see the scythe I took from the Redcap and realize I intended to kill her next. She was just as smart as me, although probably even smarter. 13-year-old me felt stupid for not acknowledging that sooner. "That's an offer I would consider," I said after some thought, knowing I shouldn't outright agree, even though I intended to lie, because words held a certain power for the Fae. For all I knew, outright saying yes would instantly make shackles and chains appear on my body out of thin air. It felt like walking on eggshells or losing a mind game like chess. I resumed playing the music and started to whistle, trying to distract her so I could continue thinking of how to outsmart her. I poured my heart into it, remembering how Dustin had played it in his burrow, and Aurdone became entranced by the sound. Before, she had stilled to the point where she looked like a lifeless doll, but now she swayed gently like a flower in a breeze, her black eyes fixated on the glasses as I tapped at them with a spoon. I waved one hand in front of her face, and she didn't move a muscle, not registering the movement at all. Pixies came and danced around us, also charmed by the music. I slowed down the tempo before ceasing the music altogether, and she still didn't snap out of it. I continued to whistle as I slowly got up, grabbed the scythe, and moved behind her. She was still swaying. I reared back the scythe, ready to slice at her long neck. "You lack subtlety like a giant in a hedge maze," her voice whispered into my ear. My heart lurched in my chest. Faster than I could blink, the now fake Aurdone that was in front of me dissipated into a cloud of glitter, and the real Fae Mother loomed behind me. Her fingers snaked around my neck one by one, and she grabbed the cheap cord holding up my iron pendant, and it withered away to nothing. My only protection, the iron charm, dropped to the ground, and I instinctively tried to reach for it. But she warningly squeezed my throat just a bit, and pressed her claws against my skin almost hard enough to draw blood. "Please," was all I could muster as I dropped the scythe and shook like a leaf. I was too terrified to even turn around to face her. I could feel her long hair brush the sides of my face. Vines snaked along the ground and swept away the iron pendant from my feet, far from my reach. Just how many abilities did this monster possess? I have been fooled this way before, Aurdone said, and suddenly images of Dustin's escape flashed through my mind as if she was projecting the memory of him cutting her head off into my brain. All attempts to slay me after this one should have been original, if conducted with intelligence. If you become my servant, you will tirelessly try to end my life. If you have nothing more to offer, I will try to kill you quickly before the little ones return and make things difficult. Wait. I shrieked desperately as I felt her fingers tighten over my throat, throwing myself forward onto the ground. I scrambled over to my backpack, crying the whole way there, and fished out one of the large iron-infused chocolate bars I had made, wrapped in plastic. It's the best I have. It cost me a fortune. I lied through my fearful sobs. I cannot be fooled by the quality of offerings. Aurdone gingerly took the chocolate. If it doesn't taste exquisite, it will be spat out, and I'll have your life instead. You'll like it, I promise. I watched hungrily as she daintily brought the chocolate to her mouth. Then her hand froze, the candy inches from her lips. She took a deep whiff. My blood ran cold. I thought quickly to save myself. This dash, she began. Actually, I blurted, launching forward to snatch the chocolate away. She seemed affronted by my rude actions. I forgot this chocolate is special. It's for Zoe. I want her to have it. I'll trade my life instead. You're not worth this gift. Aurdone was deeply offended by that, just as I had expected, and her slender frame grew rigid as her black eyes widened. What did you say? I said it's not yours, so you can't have it. I was unable to keep the spite out of my voice as I kicked things up a notch. I changed my mind. You're an ugly creature, and you don't deserve a gift like this anyways. I would rather have someone I like to have it instead. What a wretched little whelp you are. Aurdone smiled. It was loaded with malice and just a tinge of amusement. After I eat this, I think I'll keep you and your sister here until you grow old and your bones turn to dust. I'll leave your grandmother good fortune in trade for your slavery. I watched as the Fae mother gaped her mouth open wide as anything and dropped the chocolate inside. It disappeared down her gullet, and she grinned tauntingly at me, the corners of her lips stretching her face beyond what was anatomically possible. There goes your special gift I'm not worthy of. I picked up the scythe and stepped back, waiting. Aurdone frowned, not expecting this reaction. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, she keeled over and vomited a stream of a tar-like substance onto the ground. Her white skin became gray and speckled like a gargoyle again. Her veins bulged against her skin, and her gown rotted right off her body. Her wings shriveled up and fell from her back like rotten flower petals as she continuously dry-heaved, retched, and vomited. It was so violent and disgusting I still get nauseous just thinking about it. She clutched her stomach, which was drawing in on itself as her ribcage became more pronounced. Her once beautiful form became emaciated-looking. She was naked and looking more like a corpse with each second. Her gaunt face snapped towards me, rage registering on her ghoulish features. She couldn't even talk anymore. She simply howled and groaned, stumbling towards me. Her claws were as long as machetes now, itching to dig deep into my flesh. Give me the key. My hands shook around the scythe. I couldn't muster the courage to swing it at her. She only screeched and lurched towards me like the undead. I ducked out of the way and kicked the back of her knee, sending her sprawling over the ground. Then, adrenaline coursing through my veins and fueled by primal fear, I bashed her head with the handle of the scythe. Greatly weakened, it seemed she could hardly get up. So I placed my foot on her head to keep her down and swung at her neck like an executioner. It took a few awkward hits, since I had a scythe and not something like an axe. But eventually her head was severed, thus silencing her agonized groans, and I hastily seized the key, which was around her neck. I watched as her body turned to dust, leaving the piece of iron lying among the pile. I could hardly believe what just unfolded, and the feeling of it all being a dream hit me 10 times harder as I fell onto the grass and stared at her remains for a while. I got myself together and went into the cottage, where I saw a surprising sight. Boza was now in the cage, with a smug-looking Zoe standing outside of it and tossing fruit at her head. She would later tell me that she had tricked her, suggesting an idea for a game where they would switch roles and the Fae girl would become the pet. Boza had turned grotesque like her mother, but only in anger, as she freaked out and screamed furiously behind the golden bars. "Stop that, let's go." I grabbed Zoe's arm and pulled her away. We trekked all the way back to the tree archway, only to see that the portal was gone. Instead of the normal woods behind our house, waiting just beyond the threshold, it was more otherworld woodlands. I just remember collapsing on the ground and sobbing my heart out at the fact we didn't make it in time. Zoe knelt beside me and started crying too. Once I composed myself, I took this moment to unlock her collar and remove it from her neck. "What are we gonna do?" she asked. I thought for a moment. If Aurdone knew how to open the portal, maybe she passed down this knowledge to Boza? I have an idea. I grabbed her hand, and once again, we returned to that cottage that I was all but sick of seeing at that point. Boza had calmed down and was now sitting and weeping. Her appearance returned to normal. It made me feel a twinge of guilt, but I reminded myself that she was the spawn of a monster, and so I sauntered over to the cage and addressed her. "How do we open the portal to our world?" Boza glared at me. "Where's my mommy?" "She's gathering those fish creatures at the creek." I lied. "She said we're free to go, but she's too busy to help us at the moment." "How does she open the portal?" "I'm not helping you." Boza tipped her chin up defiantly and crossed her arms. "If you tell us how, I'll set you free," I bargained, dangling the key for her to see. "And if it's not a lie or a trick, I'll give you this chocolate before we go." Zoe gave me a look, thinking I meant the iron-infused chocolate, but understanding crossed her face as I produced a more Fae-safe candy from my backpack. As much as I didn't like Boza, I wasn't fully willing to see her suffer the same painful date as her mother. "Okay." Boza's face softened. Then she pointed at the silver harp I had seen Aurdone with earlier leaning against the wall. "Mom plays that and it opens. It's special, so you can't lose it." "I won't lose it," I promised, grateful for her help, as I unlocked the cage. She snatched the candy from my hands and devoured it, spat it out when she realized plastic encased it, tore the wrapper off, then ate the snack-sized chocolate ravenously. "Your mom plays the harp beautifully. Could you play it for us and open the portal?" "For another chocolate, yes." Boza nodded. "After all, you only told me to tell you how." "Whatever." I rolled my eyes and gave the little fairy girl another chocolate. She smiled brattily, ate the chocolate, grabbed the harp, and led us out the cottage. "Follow me." For what felt like the millionth time, we returned to those two weird conjoined trees in the forest. Zoe seemed in high spirits since Dustin's death, but quite exhausted, and Boza hummed the entire way with her dragonfly wings fluttering on her back. When we got there, she sat on a tree stump and her fingers danced over the silver strings of the gleaming harp. I almost fell asleep standing just listening to it, and my eyes never left the sight as my mind fogged. She glowed softly, like wan moonlight, and the archway began to shimmer. Yay. Zoe squealed as the portal appeared, showing us the dark and bleak forest around Grandma's house. Her shrill voice snapped me out of my stupor, and I had to stop her from running right through it. "Boza, one last thing," I said to the pale fairy. Boza gave me a curious and distrusting look. "Give me that harp." I ignored Zoe's questioning look. If the harp could open the portal, nothing would stop any more fairies around here from getting to us. What if Boza discovered what I had done to her mother, grew up, and decided to enact revenge on our family? You humans are so greedy. Boza giggled. We've done so many trades already. Here's another chocolate, now give it. I said more forcefully, throwing one more candy at her. She frowned as it bounced off her little chest and landed on the ground. I reached for the harp, but she started to fly out of my reach, wings buzzing obnoxiously loud. Nina, stop being mean. Zoe chastised me, making me want to throttle her because she got me in this mess in the first place. This is Mommy's. It's not worth sweet food. Boza snapped. That isn't a fair trade. Give me something better. Here. I turned my backpack upside down furiously and dumped out everything I had. Of course, none of it interested her. No, thank you. Boza said after examining everything. My anger grew. What about this? I showed her the large chocolate with the iron in it, and Zoe gasped. I had grown tired of this nonsense and didn't even care if the little fairy girl got hurt. It's the best chocolate you can get in the human world. It's big and delicious. I said no. Boza quite literally hissed at me like a snake or a rabid cat. I couldn't even get her to eat poison, it seemed. What would I do? Zoe tugged my sleeve nervously. Let's just go, but I didn't want to leave without being sure we wouldn't be in danger. How could I ever continue my life? You little brat, you stole my sister away. It's the least you could do. I lost my temper at her. Boza stuck her tongue out at me. She wanted to play. I'll do it again, too. That'll teach you to be mean to me. She then turned and started to fly away at a casual pace, humming as if no longer concerned with us. Our eyes widened at the threat, and my blood started to boil. I looked at the ground, my eyes fixing on the moon-shaped iron pendant lying there. I picked it up and threw it at her back with all my might. No sooner than it made contact with the flesh between her shoulder blades, Boza released a screech of pain. Where it had touched her grew a patch of stone gray, sickly flesh with black veins, which spread across her back. She gradually dropped, growing weaker, like a housefly sprayed with bug repellent. Zoe watched in horror as her wings and the little hair-like feelers she had back there curled in on themselves and fell. Boza was now a flightless fairy, sobbing and screaming in agony as she crouched on the ground, finger reaching back to touch where her wings once were. But she wasn't dying like her mother had. It was just that one area that had been infected. Nina, what did you do? Zoe confronted me. Mommy. Boza wept. Remorse hit me like a bullet train, and I hastily ran over and scooped the Fae child into my arms. She was so wrought with pain that she didn't even struggle. She let me carry her through the portal into our world. Zoe followed me through the dark woods, bringing the silver harp with us, as I carried her to Grandma's house with us. I banged on the door until the old woman finally woke up and came down. She looked like she was looking at a bunch of ghosts when she saw us. Nina, Zoe, Grandma cried. Oh my God, it's been months since you went missing. Months. Zoe and I cried out at the same time. Who is that? Grandma pointed at Boza, who had at some point fainted, presumably from the shock of her injury, during our walk through the forest. She then spotted the weird gray tone of her back. And what on God's green earth happened to her? We came inside, and I laid Boza on our couch. I told Grandma everything as me, and Zoe feasted on leftovers and drank warm milk until our stomachs were about to burst, absolutely starving to an unnatural extent after leaving the other world. The dreamlike feeling had gradually faded with each passing minute, and a splitting headache persisted in both of us. We had vertigo every time we tried to stand, and our bodies ached. To name a couple more symptoms I remember. We didn't tell her about Dustin, because it seemed too heartbreaking of news to share. We wished we could have brought him back to her and felt bad. Grandma had no trouble believing every word we said, since she already knew the Fae existed. However, although she was happy to the point of tears that we were back, She seemed absolutely terrified that Boza was there. She was sure that me killing Aurdone would bring a horrible curse upon our family, possibly by a relative or friend of the Fairies that we hadn't met, or maybe even by Boza herself, if she realized what had been done. I told her that I'd lied and said Aurdone was alive, but still, this didn't ease the old woman's worries one bit. Once I told her we saw no other relatives of the two or even any neighbors, she seemed to relax just a little bit. Grandma decided to bury the harp under her rose bushes right then and there, with me helping to ensure the task was done quickly. She did not want Boza using it to open the portal back to the other world. Then she sat Zoe and I down and explained that she was going to adopt Boza into our family legally and change her name, in hopes that treating Boza more kindly than those fairies had ever treated Zoe would make any potential Fae entity mercifully rethink any revenge plots. Boza didn't wake until the next day, and when she did, she was oddly silent and dejected. Her eyes were not black like pools of ink, but human-like with blue irises like in Zoe's drawings. I guess being in our world changes their appearance. She seemed less alien-like as well, looking for all the world like a regular albino kid. As soon as her eyes cracked open, Grandma was there with food and drink and a kind smile, telling her that her name would be Lana and she would be staying with us in the meantime. Boza, surprisingly, was obedient and accompanied us as we went with Grandma to the police station and hospital. Zoe and I were taken off the missing children's list, and a report was made for Lana, and as expected, no one came forward to claim her, so our grandmother was given custody. We were all checked up in the hospital, and thankfully Lana's allergic reaction to the iron has faded away by then, although she acted up when the nurses and doctors tried touching her during the physical. After getting over her silent, meek phase, Lana became comfortable and was quite feral. In class, she was the most ill-tempered and badly behaved student. She often ran on all fours whenever she played, ate bugs out of the ground and crawfish right from the creek, and she didn't understand at first that tables and counters were not to be climbed on. When she was hungry, she would raid the fridge and eat raw steaks from the freezer, making the kitchen look like a tornado had hit it. She dearly missed having her wings and sometimes cried about it, since they never grew back. Of course, she absolutely despised me, and at first she hated Zoe and Grandma too, but she eventually warmed up to them. Zoe hardly asked me to play anymore, as Lana became her best friend in school and at home. Lana wore normal human clothes, but she had to slowly realize what was socially acceptable fashion and what wasn't, as her outfits were all wildly mismatched at first. I tried to make amends with Lana as the years went by, but she never let up the constant insults and pranks. She always threatened to curse me but never did, although she still seemed to have strange abilities. My things from my room would always go missing and end up in weird places if they were ever found to begin with, even after I got a lock and kept my room inaccessible whenever I wasn't in there. She even invaded my dreams, and initially I thought they were normal dreams, but she would slyly reference something that happened in them to me the next day, letting me know she was actually there. Grandma could never get her to stop, but just seemed glad she wasn't doing any real harm to me. Over time, Zoe forgot all about what happened, her abduction, and our time in the other world. We stopped talking about it after that first night back, and then when I tried to bring it up again months later, she looked shocked and said she thought it had been a weird dream. She told me she didn't want to talk about it. Then a year later, I brought it up once more, and that time she didn't believe that it had happened at all. She believed the story that Grandma told the police. We found a strange lost girl in the woods who didn't remember how she got there, where her home was, or who her family were. She genuinely believed Lana was never Boza and always had been human. Eventually, the memory faded from my mind as well. Every time I tried to recall it, I remembered less and less until it all became very fuzzy. So here I am, a college student on winter break, with Zoe and Lana watching Christmas specials downstairs as Grandma cooked up a storm, looking at this old drawing of Zoe and Lana with wings. Everything has come flooding back to me, and it's overwhelming. The teenage girl downstairs was a Fae whose mother I'd killed. I just hope that she can one day forgive me for my sake, not hers. Thank you for watching the video and joining me beyond the veil. If you like the story, be sure to show the story creator your support by liking their story. You may find more from the story creator that you may like. Also, hit the like, subscribe, and comment down below your favorite part of the story and what kind of story genre do you like. Join our Discord and become one of our shadowlings.